This morning, we continue on in our Summer of Psalms, and I'd like to say thank you to Ron Sample for having been here the last couple of weeks. I appreciate him being here in the service with you and sharing with you, and it's been a great joy to get to know him and to get to know Betty better, and I'm glad that the reports that I got back from him and from the congregation were that you had received him warmly, and that it was for him kind of a great joy. It's a great joy for him to be here with you. And so thank you for that. I'm also grateful this morning to have my family with me from the other side of the country, quite literally. My parents and my nephew here from Georgia. And so it's good to be actually worshiping with them today. Now, when I was a kid, I wanted a dog. And I read all the great works of literature about a boy and his dog, mostly from the 19th century, things like Old Yeller and White Fang and Call of the Wild and all of those kinds of things. And I decided that a walk in the woods was incomplete without a dog. However, there's a slight problem with having a dog in our family. My mother was allergic to cats and dogs at the time, and my father wasn't interested in having another animal in the house. He had 2 children. That said, we did try to be pet owners for some time. We tried, but it didn't exactly work so great. We tried birds to start with. My parents bought a couple of parakeets early in their marriage, and things were okay for a while, but they went out of town one weekend and left on a Friday to go visit family. It was early fall in Georgia, which is what would be considered summer here. And they came back, and as they came back home, they found that they had had a hard frost over the weekend. And even in Georgia, freezing is freezing. And the heater wasn't turned on, and the poor, unfortunate animals, they froze. The second set of parakeets that we tried to have, we put them outside for some air. My mother did this on a daily basis. She hung their cage outside to let them get some fresh air. And my father came out and he started this gas grill and turned the gas on. The phone rang and he went back in the house. And, he forgot to turn the gas off. And when he came back out, he hit the igniter, and unfortunately it cooked more than the hamburgers. So that didn't go so well for them. We tried fish several times. Some of the fish we got were just substandard fish. They were just bad fish. You know, that happens sometimes. You get fish in the store and they have fin rot and you don't know it, and they die of fishy diseases. But once we were doing pretty well with them, and we had gotten them going in the right direction, and we checked all the details. We were doing great with the fish. We set the thermometer on the tank one Friday before we went out of town, and while we were gone, the heater got stuck. And when we got home, there was something really strange going on. There was heat coming off of the fish tank from about a foot away, and the fish were swimming sideways, and some of them upside down, and that kind of let us know there was something wrong there. Well, birds fly away, unfortunately, or freeze, and you can't walk fish. So finally, my mother managed. We never got to do this. I couldn't convince them, but my mother decided when I was in high school that she was going to get a dog. A friend of hers had a litter of them, and she came home from work one day with this dog, and she named it Princess. And nobody in the family would bring themselves to call the dog Princess. My dad called it Puppy, so everybody in the family called it Puppy. So we had this dog named Puppy. It lived to be 13 years old, making it the longest lasting pet in our household. But we still committed a few no-nos, even with the dog. It ate table scraps. It ate M&Ms. It ate chocolate. It ate a number of digestive nightmares for a dog, but the dog was fine. The dog was perfectly happy. Now, I didn't really think of it as being much of a dog. It wasn't a real dog to me. It was a cockapoo. It's not a real dog. It's a mop with legs. So I held pillows over its head, and it would snarl and snap at the pillows and stuff like that. And then I would throw things down the hallway, and we had a wood floor in the hallway, and I would throw them halfway down so that the dog would run at it and then slide into the door at the end of the hallway. Now, don't go calling the SPCA or anything like that. The dog was fine. We didn't do any damage to it. It was never harmed in the last few years of my childhood. But one thing about Puppy, if you called her, she came. I could be holding the pillow over her, but I could put the pillow away and she would stop snarling and she would hop up in my lap and want me to pet her. This dog was as much family, sometimes more so, than anyone else in the family. Like all dogs, she displayed a loyalty to us no matter what. This faithfulness that's a quality of our dog was shared by most other members of her species. It's the reason that we give them the generic name Fido. It comes from the Latin word fidelis. It means faithful. Now, I think this idea of what it means for a dog to be a good dog has some similarity with what it means for us to be good and faithful in Psalm 15. Just as a good dog has certain qualities that make it a good dog, the psalmist sees certain qualities that we should have in order to remain in the presence of God, in order to be what the Bible terms as good, because it is those who are good who are in the presence of God. Now, this is not to say that the list is absolutely complete or absolute, but the psalmist is trying to make a greater point beyond that, as we will see. Now, I believe that there's a theologian named James May who gets to the heart of this, and he asks these questions. What is at issue when we come in the presence of the Lord? Who are we and what should we be as we come? I think these are questions of worship in this psalm with reference to the idea of sanctuary worship. But I also believe it's a prescription for worship beyond the doors of our gathering house, especially if we look at this psalm in light of the Decalogue, or the Ten Commandments, and the Sermon on the Mount. Psalm 15 is intended as liturgy. It's a song to be used in the formal worship of the Jewish people. And by extension, it becomes something that we as followers of Jesus would use in worship as well. There's a theologian named Pat Miller who speaks of the original use of this psalm, and he talks about how the Torah liturgy in Psalm 15 sets forth certain conditions for entry into the sanctuary for worship. Now, whatever the occasion or the liturgical acts involved, the intention of the psalm, in his opinion, is clear. It declares the necessity for purity of life and righteous conduct as a prerequisite for appearing before a holy God in his sanctuary. And it elaborates the character of such conduct in the body of the psalm. And this link between worship and ethic, between your way of being with God and your way of life with neighbor, runs throughout the Old Testament and is the underlying assumption of this particular psalm. Now, in the Catholic Church and mainline churches, sometimes they make use of something called the Psalter. It's a section of our hymnal that has call and response verses that are sung and spoken. There's a sense in which the church learns theology through this idea of the Psalter, and they learn ethics in this music when it's sung and it's used as liturgy. And so that's what they did. And in some sense, that's what we're doing this morning. Now, each psalm has its own message to teach, as we have found through the summer, and Psalm 15 is not an exception to this. I think a key to understanding this psalm lies in the intent that's found in the first two verses. The first two verses ask questions. Who can live in your tent, Lord? Who can dwell on your holy mountain? Now, as we think about this, I think it's possible to see this as two important places for the Jewish people. This idea of who can live in your tent, I believe, goes back to the tabernacle in the wilderness. If you remember the Exodus story, at a certain point, God gave them instructions for putting together the tabernacle or the tent of meeting. And this is where they met with God, where the presence of God resided while they wandered in the wilderness. It also refers in this passage to who can dwell on your holy mountain, which of course is a reference to the Temple Mount in Jerusalem, Mount Zion. The idea behind this usage is that of asking, what kind of person is in the presence of God? What does it mean to be the kind of person who can be present with God and who God can work in and through? Presence, I think, is a key to understanding this idea. This idea which speaks in some ways of the idea of shalom or well-being, something also tied to being in the presence of God. When we feel or experience God's presence, what we're experiencing is shalom, well-being. The obverse is also a reality. When we do not feel or experience the presence of God, we cannot truly know well-being, making this the central idea behind this psalm. In other words, what it means to be in the presence of God and what it means to be absent from God. Now, when we think of being good, we tend to think of lists of rules that must be obeyed with absolute certainty or unwavering loyalty. For many people, the idea of good is a matter of following what we would call prescribed law without fail. And if you do this, this appeases God. If we do all the right things, if we say all the right things, if we believe all the right things, if we assent to certain ideas, God is happy with us. In this and many other psalms, and for that matter throughout the Old Testament, the law comes across as something punitive. It's punishment to be meted out with certain infractions. Do this or don't do that. Positive or negative things happen depending on the circumstance. In other words, it's a balancing act. You can almost see it like a scale. If this side of the scale gets tipped in this direction, God is happy. If it gets tipped in this direction, not so much. If we tip the scale this way, some magic door opens over here and we can be in the presence of God. If we tip it this way, then we just wander off away from God. Much of the psalm is written in this way. The psalmist asks the questions about who is able to be in the presence of God and then answers with these rules. The person who lives free of blame, the person who does what is right, speaks the truth sincerely, who does no damage with their talk, who does not harm a friend, doesn't insult a neighbor, someone who despises those who act wickedly, but honors those who honor the Lord, someone who keeps their promise even when it hurts, someone who doesn't lend money at interest, who won't accept a bribe against an innocent person. In short, you can be in the presence of God if you speak well and treat others fairly, especially with the way you talk and the way you deal with finances. Such things were terribly important in a small agrarian community where gossip and slander might destroy a person or a family's standing. Ultimately, the psalm calls for us to have respect for God's worship and respect for the worshiping community, a means of being at peace with God by obeying the law as a holy expectation and at peace with neighbor by obeying the law as a moral civil code. Now, the Apostle Paul comes in the book of Romans and he begins to look at this kind of thinking and he begins to say, you know, there's something deeper than that. There's something under that. For the first half of his letter to the Roman church, Paul talks endlessly of the law, how the Jews knew it, they didn't do it in Romans chapter 2, and how the Gentiles can be righteous by doing it even if they don't know they're doing it, which is a little further down in chapter 2. And how those of us who are in Jesus or living in the way of being like Jesus are no longer accountable to the law as it was understood or but are bound to the interpretation of the law which is understood by Jesus, which is in Romans 7 and 8. In other words, Paul looked at the law of Moses as like training wheels on a bicycle. Use it until you learn the way of living and being in Jesus. So, I guess the question is, we all understand for the most part what it is to follow the rules, right? We follow them every day. Anybody run red lights this morning on the way to church? You don't even drive. What are you laughing about? Goodness. Anybody steal from the bank this morning on their way into church? Pick up a little something extra for the offering plate. No. We all understand this idea of prescribed rules. We all understand what it means to follow the rules. Now the question is, what happens when we take the training wheels off? What happens when we become the kind of people that understand the reason for the law, not just the law itself? How do we understand good and bad beyond a list of things to do? Well, as disciples, we seek to be imitators of Jesus. Those who understand as he understands, think as he thinks, live as he lived. The magnum opus, or the grand masterpiece of Jesus-like thinking, is in Matthew 5 through 7. It's the Sermon on the Mount. In this relatively short treatise recorded 2 generations after Jesus' death, we find a collection of the great teachings of Jesus. In this, we find a way of living and being that calls us away from the law as a simple moral code of do's and don'ts into a higher relational understanding of the law. Now, the Sermon on the Mount is a call to a new way of life that goes beyond legalism, beyond the control-based understanding of the law as was practiced by Pharisees of Jesus' day and the expressions of empty worship that Jesus condemned in the Sadducees of his day. Consider Jesus' words in the Beatitudes, a calling to life of peace within ourselves that leads to a life of peace with God and neighbor. A call follows this to be salt and light with a reinterpretation of the previous understanding of law. That reinterpretation sees the previous perspective to be lacking, as it never gets to the root of why the law exists. To learn to have a change of heart and being, consider Jesus' reinterpretations within the Sermon on the Mount. As he says, you have heard, which is a former understanding of the law, but I say to you, a deeper, change-oriented understanding of the law. You have heard it said, don't commit murder. I say, don't hate your brother. You've heard it said, don't commit adultery. I say, don't have a lustful heart. You say, don't make solemn pledges. I say, don't swear at all. You've heard it said, an eye for an eye. I say, if people slap your right cheek, offer them your left one as well. You've heard it said you must love your neighbor. I say, love your enemies as well. On and on throughout the sermon, Jesus reiterates that the heart attitude is more important than just following the rules. As he says, from the heart springs all things. We're called to live beyond the rules to the understanding behind them, which is ultimately a change in being for the purpose of changing the world around us. When we live into this way of life, the kingdom of heaven becomes not a place in the by and by, but a place of the here and the now, where it's experienced by all, and where salvation or wholeness, where well-being has the opportunity to come to every heart. So my admonition to us this morning, the thing that I would encourage you to do, is for us to be good boys, be good girls, but to know that it goes far beyond just the things we're doing. It goes into the things that we're feeling. I think a great example of this, as I remember from years ago, goes back to the dog. If you walk up to a dog and you say, "Good boy," then the dog usually sticks out its tongue and starts wagging its tail and looks all happy. But if I walked up to a dog and I went, "Good boy," the dog's going to cower or snarl. It's going to get defensive. Why? Because dogs don't know English. They know attitude. They're not hearing your words because dogs don't know words. Dogs feel what you feel. They're experiencing your attitude. In the same way, in this life, if we obey the commandments, but we do it begrudgingly, if we live a Christian life, even if we are willing to accept these teachings of Jesus and we decide that we're not going to do the "you heard it said" stuff, but we're going to do the "but I say" stuff, but you do it with the wrong heart attitude, people know it. People sense it. People can feel it. You can fool some of the people some of the time, but you can't fool all the people all the time. You're going to be found out. Make the change of heart. Because the change of heart is what draws us closer to God, closer to neighbor. Change of heart is where we show true love of God and true love of neighbor. The change of heart is where we truly become Christ-like as a people. I invite you now to stand with me. Stand and join me in our confessional prayer. God of the deserts, the seas, and the skies, we come before you now as a one true God. We praise you for bringing light and color into our lives and for filling us with a desire to serve. In your presence, we sense your promise and encouragement, your belief in us as your children, and are happy to receive your warmth and your love. So many times we have questioned you and turned away from you, disbelieving your will for us, stifling ourselves in the darkness of that disbelief, and failing not only ourselves, but those whom we love. Forgive us when we fail to walk in your ways, when we have been incapacitated by our own weaknesses, bringing a sense of guilt and sometimes despair. We ask that you do not give up on us, that you take us by the hand and put us back on course, a course leading to contentment and fulfillment, underpinned by your strength and love. Restore us to yourself, that we might lift up our hearts and minds and voices to focus on Christ calling us to follow him wherever that may be.